Prescott, God began this miracle of raising up disciples who would be sent to the cities and nations of the world. And my pastor, Harold Warner, was one of them. He got to Tucson and he knew that his mission there was clear, to do exactly the same thing in Tucson that God was doing in Prescott, which was to raise up disciples and send them to the cities and nations of the world, and Salt Lake City was one of them.
The Door Church in West Jordan was established in 1989, and for the last 30 years, this church has been investing in the kingdom of God. We consider ourselves a New Testament church. We're a community of believers that are invested in planting churches, because the house of God is so important, and the people of God getting together is so important. Jesus was incredibly passionate about the church. Jesus started what we're doing. This is all about him. Our church's vision is discipleship, church planting, and world evangelism.
I gave my life to Jesus when I was 15. I've been in this church essentially half of its life. This church has gone through so much. It's gone through tragedy, it's gone through heartbreak, it's had seasons of joy, seasons of increase, of revival, and it's gone through pastoral changes. God's met us so much along the way. He's helped us. We've been able to go through hard things, and we're still doing something for Jesus. You have a collection of lives together and making it through each season. It's a beautiful thing.
The work in Utah began in 1982 when Mike and Mary Webb were announced to come here. They pioneered the first church.
When we were in Salt Lake, we were far away from other churches. It was my wife and I doing all the flyer passing out and putting the posters up. And sometimes we had a good response, but there were sometimes we didn't. I just learned from that it's not all about me. It's not about my performance. It's not about what I can do. This is God's work, and He's the one who will have to make it happen, and all we can do is all that we can do.
It was basically Elaine and I in this tiny little church. Pastor Mike, he was a witnessing machine. I began to walk with him, behind him, and before long I was taking charge. And Mike was our pastor for maybe 2 years. After that, Pastor Ray came in.
And when Pastor Warner told my wife and I that we should pray about coming to Salt Lake City, I was a bit crestfallen because I was door director in Tucson at the time.
He created each individual person with a specific cause, with a specific purpose and destiny.
I knew that the day would come when I'd get sent out, and I had this short list of places that I thought about going to, and Utah was nowhere on the list. But once that was settled, my wife and I began to pray about Salt Lake City, and our hearts completely changed. We couldn't wait to get here, cross the point of the mountain probably around 10 o'clock at night. I just really felt the destiny of God. But it also was very clear to me that this was a very unique place spiritually. But God spoke to me very early on and said, I didn't call you there to talk about Mormonism. I called you there to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so that's all I did.
We were saved probably closer to 1985, and the change in our lives, we committed to it. The key people in my life was, yes, Pastor Ray, but it was Don Rivera, who was my brother-in-law. As I began to watch him and other people, I realized what they had was real. I wonder, why are they so happy? There was a brightness to them. I was the last person to ever think that God would use me, especially as a preacher. But I remember one particular revival, and I remember the evangelist preaching and saying, who's here that feels a call to preach? Something in my heart just like was bursting in the inside, and I could feel it wasn't me, it was God. And I remember lifting my hand, and Gina was sitting next to me, and she pulled my hand down. She goes, "What are you doing?" And I go, "I don't know, but I have this passion." She goes, "You can't do this." So she's holding my right hand, I lifted my other hand, and I remember that was a key decision for me.
1989, he and Gina went into Midvale. That was the first church plant out of our church in Salt Lake City. We started in Midvale, ended up in Kearns.
Amen. My name is Anthony Trujillo. My beautiful wife and best friend, amen, pastor the church in Kearns, Utah. Amen. We're seeing God do tremendous things there.
My daughters would sit in the front row, and Anna was older, and she would just sit there, and she would tell me, "Dad, there is nobody here."
My dad was preaching like there's 100 people in the room, and it went from just no one to all of a sudden, there's 15, 20 people coming to church.
Finally, a family member that came with a sister, and she's walking in, she's 16 years old, she's holding a precious young girl, and we didn't understand that it was actually Brandy.
I was born in Joliet, Illinois, but I came to Utah when I was a toddler. I grew up in Kearns. My parents had 8 children, and they worked to support us, that nobody raised us. So I always felt abandoned. When I was 15, I told my mom that I was pregnant, and she said, "If you keep the baby, it's mine." People wanted me to give the baby up for adoption. They wanted me to have an abortion. And so I left home. I couch surfed for like my whole pregnancy. I just wanted to protect Brandy. Like I had something to prove, I can do better. This baby's gonna be the only one in my world that's gonna love me back. Jerry and we met when I was 16 with the 4-month-old baby, and he was 25. We got married a year later. That first year of marriage was really rocky, and I felt no hope. Like I was completely just lost. I had attempted suicide several times, but my sister was a Christian, and she says, "Mary, if you don't want your life, why don't you give it to Jesus? You've tried everything else." So in September of 1993, I gave my life to Jesus. A couple months later, Jerry followed.
I just want to thank God for coming into my life, and I gave my life to Jesus, and my husband, he gave his life to Jesus, and God's restored our marriage. He's gave us that love that we've never had before. He's healed my heart where I can love my family like I've never loved them before.
I praise God for delivering from drugs. I'd smoke pot every hour on the hour. I couldn't give myself to the family. God showed me the light, and He set me free. And now I take care of my daughter. We play together. I just like to thank God for that and giving me my life back.
Amen. Pastor Anthony and Gina were like parents to me, but really surrendering to Jesus and not just a church or a religion. I finally felt hope for my life. There was the joy. You can't even explain it.
In time, Anthony Trujillo and Gina left and joined me in Las Vegas, New Mexico, where he became a part of that congregation and went into the evangelistic ministry for a time. And now they pastor a thriving work in Lakewood, Colorado. Bill and Kim Neal took the church in Kearns, and I'm very grateful to them because they began to open their hearts and to love people that I cared very much about. And I'll always appreciate them, the people that I consider to be family, now a part of their family too.
Coming in 97, my family was in the Santa Monica church, and so that's really what we tried to bring to the church in Kearns.
Pastor Bill was not Pastor Bill when he came to my house. He was a guy that was gung-ho, but he's still like I was a teenager in the late 80s. He was with me pioneering in Pacific Palisades. He was my worship leader. You know, I was more like a father to Bill at that time.
Pastor Bill and I shared a room, and he'd be working on his guitar, trying to write songs, and all I wanted to do was go to sleep. And it really frustrated me that he wanted to keep singing and play music. But he was like a hero / big brother to me. And for him to go to Utah was like, you might as well, I'm never gonna see him again. Like, he's going to the moon.
When that happened and Bill Neal went there, that's when our church, the Lighthouse, we were involved in Utah at that point. That means financially and in every way.
The church was pioneer work, but it was doing well, so we were excited to come, and we felt really privileged. It was fresh, it was new.
And we were all pretty young, you know, at the time. All of us had, you know, smaller kids. And I think one of the things I learned young in ministry is because of a lot of brokenness in young people coming in. It's almost like I needed to be a father before I was a pastor.
Originally, I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada. That's where I was born. Growing up, family life was just really unstable. I'm 15 years old. At that point, I had lived a life of addiction, smoked a lot of weed, smoked a lot of methamphetamine, drank alcohol, addicted to sex, selling drugs. So when we moved to Utah, we left one city to get away from that lifestyle, and it's the same thing. Nothing's really changed. It's kind of like how they say, no matter where you go, there you are. Debbie invited us to church. I get saved, radically saved, give my life to Jesus. It was from that moment that my life really began to change.
Moved in with Carl and Veronica, moved in with Debbie and Terry, and then moved in with us.
Markel used to be my roommate. You know, we had a lot of fun together. We used to make these silly little home videos and stuff.
Going from like, on the streets, ghetto, cursing, drugs, drama, to like living with this family who's all about Jesus, all about church. And it was like a radical shift in worlds for me, you know? But it was great as a young person because I was immersed, submerged into the church. God used that to save my life.
Real gifted as far as rapping and preaching and communicating, and now to have him 14 years later, he's got such a great family with Brandy and his kids, and now he's going to pioneer here and come and preach a revival, his first revival that he's ever done. You know, come and do it in our pioneer work is overwhelming joy.
All right, just landed in West Virginia, Charleston. Here to preach my first revival ever. The feelings inside me right now is hard to contain how excited I am. Pastor Bill is about to be here in 5 minutes, and so I don't want to be all giddy and silly when he gets here, but I am pumped up. It's truly a dream come true for me. I got saved in a revival. I love revivals, and also to be able to check out the lay of the land here. Go over to Huntington. It's like I'm thinking about leaving home. You know, I'm thinking about a new chapter in our lives, Huntington, West Virginia. I'm just so excited to be saved and be able to serve God. I'm so thankful that I'm saved. I'm so thankful for Jesus, man.
And that was really, you know, the goal of discipleship, is that your disciples will succeed and excel and go beyond anything you've ever accomplished as a discipler.
Utah is full of good memories for me. It is a place of beginning and no ends. When we left, it was one of the hardest days of my life. But just seeing all that God's done, I just marvel that we got to be a part of that.
And Bill and Kim did a great job in a very troubled season in many ways, and preserved what God was doing. And then Josh Scribner and his family took the church.
I grew up in Santa Monica along the beaches, enjoyed surfing pretty much my whole life. As the first son of ex-LA Ram Rob Scribner, football was definitely what I wanted to do when I grew up. I got saved when I was 16. So my junior and senior year of high school, I was all about God, and I really began to pursue, reaching people, and that's kind of when I stepped into ministry to become the youth pastor at the Lighthouse. I had made a decision, when I gave my life to God, there were two things that I told God I would never do. One of them was to be a pastor, and the other was to leave the beach.
When I was 5 years old, I remember my dad praying with me to ask Jesus to come into my life. And then when I was 8 years old, I remember getting baptized at our church. After that time, my parents divorced. We moved to Santa Monica, and I didn't really feel like I had a close relationship with God. Probably because I was harboring so much anger, hurt, unforgiveness. And in September of 1994, I was 16 years old. I found the Lighthouse Church in Santa Monica. I just remember Pastor Rob preaching. He said, if you want Jesus to come into your life, and I just remember shooting my hand up in the air. I remember going to the altar and praying, and when I walked out of that church, I felt like I was wearing a white robe. Like I literally just felt so free, so clean, like a burden had been lifted, and an unexplainable joy had come into my life. And I just couldn't wait to go back because I had experienced Jesus. And it's kind of funny because when I was a kid, I remember I was climbing a tree. And I remember thinking like, I don't want to marry someone that's like a priest or a pastor or something, because that would mean I have to go to church all the time. Fast forward so many years and I'm in church and I meet Josh, and he tells me that he feels that God has called him to be a pastor.
I believe it was 2005, and I was praying to God, what do you have for me this year, and what do you want? And God spoke to me the word change. Pastor Bill had been in Utah for 8 years. Pastor Warner and Pastor Rob and Pastor Bill, they asked me, is this something that you would be willing to do? And immediately that word that God spoke to me right there in that room. This is what I was talking about when I said change. I kind of had a revelation at that time that Jesus is better than surfing. Jesus is better than anything.
I had never been to Utah before, never visited. So I was kind of like, this unknown adventure awaits. What an honor to take over Pastor Bill and Kim's church that they've labored for 8 years. They are heroes in our eyes.
Where the seeds had been planted in the years before, God used our brother to bring a lot of those things to fruition.
God began to give Pastor Josh some very young, strong, true disciples.
Pastor Josh became more than just my pastor. He became more than just a brother. He really became my spiritual father.
He's the one who began to really disciple men in earnest and push them forward, as it were, into the things of God. And a lot of the things that God did in terms of the maturing of this church happened under his ministry.
It was one of the most exciting things for me to see, just to think about all that God would do using these young lives, and like the future that held. If they just kept serving God, man, it's like the sky's the limit.
My heart is in Utah. I wouldn't be who I am today without that 10-year period in Utah and all that God did in and through the people of that church. God used those people to change my life. And I'm so grateful for every one of them and for all the things that I went through with them and with the church. Josh is not the same pastor he was before we went. Our marriage has changed and grown. Our family is what it is today because of it. And I'm extremely grateful for that time, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
And God has since moved him on to Santa Monica, and Adam Neal and his wife and children have taken over the pastorate of this church. It's almost coming full circle in a lot of ways, in the sense that he's the son of Bill Neal. This is family to him. He is now picking up the mantle and pressing forward.
I've always known that Adam was called. He got called real young.
When I was like 9 years old, Pastor Alvin came to Santa Monica to preach. He had pastored in Africa. He started our churches in Sierra Leone. He wanted to pray for the kids. And so all the kids came out and we were all standing by the altar. I looked down to scratch my arm, and then when I looked at it, it was withered and it was like really skinny and like famine. And the word Africa came into my mind. And then I looked away, and when I looked back, my arm was normal. I was so excited about it. That vision pretty much instilled in me the idea that at some point I was going to be a pastor and have ministry.
I didn't know exactly what God was going to do, but it really is a privilege that he's here, because we did work hard, just like the rest of the pastors that have pastored this church. Everybody works hard, no doubt. So we're happy and proud of him and his wife.
People say, oh, aren't you really proud of Adam? And I just tell them, you know what, I'm proud of Adam whether he's pastoring or not. He is a good son. I believe he and Keisha are only at the beginning of what God's going to do in their lives through this church.
I saw my dad go do whatever God called him to do, wherever God called him to do it. He's just not afraid. And I try to take that same approach here. I don't feel shackled by any kind of oppression. I feel very good, and I think that it comes from the fact that those pastors that went before me have invested prayer and fasting until they saw a shift in the spiritual realm. Until we're done, we go in the name of the Lord, and no weapon formed against us will prosper. We are immortal until we've done all that God has called us to do.
Now, with Markel coming to West Virginia, they'll have 2 churches out, under their leadership and under their care, with Steve and Justine going to Magna. There's been others, Rodney and Becky went out, and Matthew and Rainey have gone out, Eric and Jen. It's been a challenge, but that's, with any kind of birthing process.
And even though there were many, many who came before him, it's going to be Adam Neal who's going to be out in the forefront and see the challenges and lead the people of God into what God has for them in this generation. He is himself going to have to fight some very important battles. But like any man who is honest with himself, I think he realizes he's going to need God. But I believe that there's a fire that's stirring in his soul for destiny.
You really can't despise small beginnings, because you really never know what God's going to do. People that were my friends when I was a kid are now helping me pastor this church. And honestly, I couldn't do it without their help and their investment.
So many of you were saved. You've been raised in the church, and you're all serving God together. You know what to do. You know how to lead. To see what God has done through all the amazing people that have been in this church, I am happy. I see good. I see the advancing of the kingdom of God. I'm looking forward to seeing what God does here, as well as in our fellowship worldwide. I'm happy to be a part of it and truly privileged.
Everything that he's done is about what he's going to do. For those of us who were back in those years doing what we did then, we were just doing the will of God. But what's going to give all of that eternal meaning is you doing the will of God. Taking what you've inherited and pressing in until you see everything God has for you. And should the Lord tarry, and there be generations that will follow you, they're going to bear the same burden. They're going to bear the same responsibility.
God holds us in his hand. The Bible says he's a lamp unto our feet. That doesn't mean we get to see the whole picture, but it's just the next step. I got saved when I was 15 years old. But never in my wildest dreams would I ever think that 30 years from when my parents pioneered the church, I would be preaching here. And so when you finally get to this step, it's overwhelming and humbling.
Despite everything, opposition or all the struggle, trials, the challenges that have come our way, man, I am pumped up. I still want to do something for Jesus. That's what I've learned from this church. We're going to go through hard stuff, no worries. We can still be excited and happy and ready and willing to do something for Jesus. And I am. I'm ready.
Those times that God was developing us, all of the labor, all of the work, my reward is when I stand and preach in my son's church and I see those converts and I see my grandsons. I came and preach here in Kearns to see this church amazingly still standing strong, involved. What a great future we have. And that's the joy and that's the strength. And it's revealing to us God has a purpose and a plan. What an amazing ride. We're just scratching the surface.